Hello everyone. Today's video is going to be going through OCD, and more specifically the biological explanations for OCD. So obviously we've looked at phobias and depression from a behaviorist and cognitive point of view. Now we're going to be looking at OCD from a biological point of view. And once again, can you get OCD non-biologically? Can you get it from your environment? Can you get it from your cognitions? Yes, there will be explanations for that, but we're not going to be looking at them today. We're purely going to be looking at the biological explanations for OCD. Like the other two explanation videos for psychopathology, I am going to go through, probably more briefly this time, what OCD is, and I'm going to do so using the DSM. These are on your Google site. These are available to you. My recommendation is you do really read through these, especially if you want to go into some sort of psychology degree maybe, or even mental health nursing, because it's fascinating to see how the DSM categorizes and criterias these disorders with I'll go through some things. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I do just want to point out the main symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder, and unsurprisingly, they are obsessions and compulsions, and you need to know the difference between them. That's quite important. So obsessions are internal, right? As it says here, they are recurrent and persistent thoughts that you just cannot shake, and they are disturbing to you. So it's almost a good way to think about it. It's almost as if somebody has hijacked your thinking and is making you think certain things. Now that technically is what we call intrusive thoughts. Intrusive thoughts, I've had intrusive thoughts before. They are horrible. They are horrible. At the moment, most of you have the ability to control what you're thinking, right? So if something horrible were to come into your head, you're able to go, oh, no, that's horrible, and you're able to move away from it and forget it. But someone with OCD, or someone with intrusive thinking, obsessions, will have these horrible thoughts that they just cannot shake, for example. So it might be that, if you don't turn the light on and off again 3 times, then your family are going to die. If you don't double check that your door is locked like 6, 7, 8 times, then you're going to get struck by lightning. And on some level, you kind of know that this is irrational. People with OCD, unlike people with depression, people with OCD mostly know that what they are thinking doesn't actually make sense. They know on some level, but they cannot help to shake the feeling, and they cannot shake the stress of it. So it says here, the individual will attempt to ignore or suppress the thoughts, but they will do that by actually doing a compulsion. Now, if the obsessions are the internal thinking, obsessions are within you, they're within your head. Compulsions are the behaviors that the individual does to quieten or suppress the obsessions. So you need to understand the interaction between them. People will do weird behaviors, known as compulsions, in order to try, stop the stress in their head. Okay. The problem they have is that it works. So, for example, they want to turn the light on and off and on again in their head. Turn it off, turn it on, turn it off, turn it on, and they can't help shake this feeling. They go and do it to off, on, off, on, off, on, and they feel immediately very calm. Right? That lasts a very short period of time, but it gives them some peace. What they've basically taught themselves is if you do the weird behavior, you will get some peace. But that's reinforcing. So the next time these obsessions come, they're going to go straight to the light switch. So there is a bit of a problem. Let's have a look if there's anything else here. The behaviors of the mental acts are aimed at preventing or reducing the anxiety or preventing some dreaded event. However, these behaviors or mental acts are not connected in a realistic way with what they are designed to neutralize, and they're clearly excessive. Now, the thing about OCD is it's quite difficult to hide. It's quite difficult to hide. Depression is relatively easy to hide, and people with depression hide depression quite a lot of the time. But OCD, like schizophrenia, is not necessarily that easy to hide, because for example, I had a mate who I believe he had OCD, because for many reasons, but he never got diagnosed with it. Or never went to get it checked out. But anyway, when I would call for him on the way to school, he would unlock and lock his door, leaving his house, about 6 or 7 times, and he'd walk all the way down the driveway, and then go, actually no, I want to go back and check it, and he'd go all the way back up to the door, push it like it's clearly locked. He'd go away, and then go, actually no, I need to come back and check it. That's observable. I can clearly see that he's doing that. He's not hiding it very well. The obsessions or compulsions are time consuming, so they have to take up more than an hour a day, and they need to cause significant distress. There's a couple of others that I'm not too bothered about here, but if you have a look, there's a lot here. So the prevalence rate, let's look at how common it is. The 12-month rolling prevalence rate in the US is 1.2%. Internationally, it's between 1.1 and 1.8. Now, this is how many people get OCD within 12 months. The running rate, if you will, is supposed to be around about 2%. So right now, 2% of everyone in the US, probably, of Western Europe, similar cultures, about 2% of people will have OCD. That is, at the time of filming, roughly speaking, about 80 students at Barton Peveril that will at some point get OCD, but probably pushing 85, maybe 90 in a couple of years. So, but it's every 12 months, 1.2% of people get it. There's a lot here which I'm not going to go into, but if you have a look, the mean age of the onset of OCD is about 19 and a half years, so late teen years. But 25% of cases have already started by the age of 14. A lot of these are actually quite. A lot of these cases are severe. I find this quite patronisingly insulting personally, but depression is regarded as a mild mental health disorder. And you think depression is actually quite debilitating, but in psychiatric and psychological circles, depression is seen as quite a mild disorder. And you can kind of see that when you compare it next to OCD. OCD is brutal, or it can be brutal. It's relatively common for people to be institutionalized, especially if they're young and they get OCD. It doesn't tend to occur after 35 years, but it's unusual. Boys tend to have an earlier age onset than females. Nearly 25% of males have onset before 10 years. I mean, that's quite bad. But again, we raise the question, should we be assessing mental health in our children? Some people say yes, some people say no. Should we be medicating them? Yes, no. A couple of other things as well. Here's what I was saying earlier. Compulsions are more easily diagnosed in children than obsessions because compulsions are observable. You can't see someone's obsessions because they're in their head, but you can see their compulsions. A couple of other things I think is quite fascinating here. There's a few. I'll be quick with these. So you've got, and this is bewildering to me as well. Is OCD the same across the world? Symptomatically, is it the same? No, it's not. It does appear that OCD does occur across the world. So in one form or another, OCD does happen. And there is substantial similarity in the gender distribution, the age at which we get it, and the comorbidity. There is also similarity between the main symptoms. Right, so the main symptoms, so cleaning, symmetry, hoarding, taboo thoughts, and fear of harm. However, apparently there are regional variation in symptom expression, meaning that there is some difference that is being caused by the culture you are in. So OCD, like depression, like phobias, like schizophrenia, is not exactly the same across the world. It is impacted partly by the culture you are in, and we've looked at that already with the symptom pool in definitions of abnormality. And there's a little bit about gender related diagnostic issues there. The last thing I wanted to look at was comorbidity. That's a big paragraph. Look at how many other things can come up alongside OCD. It's like anxiety in that regard. There's a lot of things that can come up alongside it. So let's have a look. So many adults with the disorder have a lifetime diagnosis of an anxiety disorder. So that's around for life. So 76%, that's a hell of a lot of people get panic disorder, social anxiety, GAD. They get a phobia maybe. So phobia comes up. Depression comes up. Depression comes up alongside OCD quite a lot. Look, 63% of people with OCD also have depression. It's incredibly rare that people just have OCD. Let's have PTSD comes up. Personality disorder comes up. This is interesting. Up to 30% of individuals with OCD also have a lifetime tic disorder. There was a couple of years ago a theory that OCD and Tourette's were the same disorder. But that has been disproven because they come from different parts of the brain. But there is definitely a link between OCD and a tic form of disorder, Tourette's obviously being a tic disorder. Look, there's a lot. They've got schizophrenia there as well. They've got trichotillomania, body dysmorphic disorder, which explains why body dysmorphic disorder is the next thing on DSM. So OCD is heavily linked to quite a lot. If you want to have a look at that in your own time, it's on the Google site. Feel free to have a look. But I want to actually start going through the biological explanations for what we have just looked at. So to be honest, there's 3 or 4 that you do need to know. Some are more important than others. The genetic one is important. One of them is the genetic explanation, which I'm going to go through. The rest are neural explanations. And that's important because you may get asked a specific question on outline one genetic explanation, of which you will obviously give the genetic explanation, but you also may be asked to give one neural explanation. And if you give the genetic one, obviously you're wrong. So let's go through this then, right? I hate genetic explanations for things because it's simply just, what causes OCD? Genes, innit? Do you know certain genes? Yeah, there's a few, although we don't really know, right? And no gene specifically causes behavior by itself. It needs the environment. So there's no 100% connection. So at most, a good evaluation for this, a fantastic evaluation for this, is at most the genetic explanation is only a partial explanation because it explains the predisposition to the disorder, but it doesn't explain the trigger of the disorder, which is the environment. So this is not a whole explanation. It's only ever a partial explanation. So let's go through this then, shall we? Yes. We've got a little bit about what obsessions and compulsions are. If you want to, I will go back to this. If you want to pause the video to make sure you're not missing anything here, feel free to do so. But I think most of it is stuff I have covered. You have obsessions, you have compulsions to quell the obsessions. But let's go into the actual genetic explanation. So if there's one thing, I'm not going to go through this necessarily because this is a lot of just general genetic stuff. Again, the slides are on Google Classroom if you want to go through this. But the whole point about all these slides are that basically what genes are and how genes work. Don't necessarily need to know this, but let's get on to genes and OCD specifically. So March and Benton. I didn't have the names for this for a very long time until I finally found it. But March and Benton looked at studies of OCD twins, the twins of OCD, and they were trying to put a number on how much of the risk of OCD is genetic. And they've come up with 4 figures essentially. So in children, 45 to best way to describe this is the following: 45 to 65% of the risk of the reasons why kids get OCD is seemingly genetic. So it does play quite a big role in kids getting OCD. 45 to 65% of the reasons why kids get their OCD, and that's a single person, by the way. So let's say, I don't know, let's say your cousin, your cousin Jerry gets OCD. I know he's 11 years old. Between 45 to 65 of the percent of the reasons why Jerry got OCD was genetic. The rest is environmental or maybe neural. In adults, that is lower. So genes play a bigger role in the development of the disorder in children than they do as adults. That's the same for diabetes, by the way. That's the same for ADHD. The genetics play a bigger role. For example, if you are susceptible to diabetes, you're probably going to get that as a kid. You're not going to get that older, type 1 anyway. So it does tell us that genes do play a role. However, none of these figures are 100%, meaning, as I say, genetics is only a partial explanation. Lewis, a very long time ago, calculated that 37% of his OCD patients had parents with OCD, and 21% had siblings with OCD. Now, on the face of it, and this is a good piece of research actually, because it demonstrates a flaw in this theory. On the face of it, there clearly is something genetic here, isn't there? If Lewis's patients, if 37% of them have got parents with OCD, 21% have got OCD, clearly there is a genetic link, you would think. However, it might also be worth pointing out that not only do their OCD patients share genes with parents and siblings, they also share environments with them as well. So how can you say that the OCD patient has got OCD because of their parents, genes, etc., etc.? Could it be the way the parents are raising the kids? Maybe if the parents have got OCD, those OCD parents will raise their children in an OCD-like manner. Their kids will look up at their parents being neat and fastidious and, cleaning their hands until their skin falls off. And maybe they will think that that is normal and thus they will copy. We know kids copy their parents. So this is a good piece of research because it kind of supports the biological explanation, but it kind of exposes a bit of a major flaw here. So the problem we also have, and there's a couple of key points I want to go through here, there is not one gene for OCD. OCD is polygenic, which means there are multiple genes involved in the onset. For example, very few things are caused by one gene. Very, very few things are caused by one gene. I think your height is caused by about 55, 57 genes, I think it is. And that's a simple thing. Your height is a very, very simple thing. 55, 57 genes interact with each other and the environment to determine your height. So OCD is thought to be caused by up to 230 different genes. Now, one thing I do want you to note down is the fact that there's so many genes involved, 230, kind of suggests or kind of explains why OCD is so varied in so many people, right? If I put two people with depression next to each other, they look exactly the same. Maybe a couple of differences. Maybe one, I don't know, feels worthless. Maybe one doesn't. But generally speaking, they look the same. If I put two people with OCD next to each other, they can look completely different. They look completely different in their symptomology. So the reason why is maybe there are different variations of the 230 genes in patient 1 compared to patient 2. So that explains why symptoms can be very, very different, because there's more genes that are involved. So, okay, moving on, because this is taking me quite a while. As I just said, there is no single gene, but you do need to know, and here's a key term that I would want you to write down in your answer. There are a couple of candidate genes. Now, candidate genes are genes that have specifically, as it says here, the term candidate gene refers to a gene that is believed to be related to a particular trait, such as a disease or a physical attribute. It's been characterized as problematic in causing certain disorders. So the SERT gene, and you need to know this, what it does. Everybody has a SERT gene. Everybody has a SERT gene. It's when it goes faulty that's the problem. So don't say, oh, OCD is caused by a SERT gene, because we all have a SERT gene, right? You probably would be dead or malfunctioning if you didn't have it, and that partly is the point, actually. So when your SERT gene goes faulty, or if you have a faulty gene, it's all to do with how well the serotonin goes across the synapse. If your gene goes faulty, this process becomes faulty, and thus it causes OCD. So SERT gene deals with how efficiently serotonin is transported. When it goes faulty, it can lead to OCD because, and you need to know this in a second, serotonin goes across the synapse too quickly. It gets reuptaken too quickly, too efficiently. The COMT gene is also linked to dopamine and clearing dopamine from the synapse, and low activity of the COMT gene is also associated. So you do need to know those two technical parts. A little bit more there on what the SERT gene actually does, just to clarify, because maybe you're watching this video to try and understand this. If you have a faulty SERT gene, this serotonin right here comes out but gets reuptaken too quickly. It never actually reaches the receptors. It comes out, and then the SERT gene will pull up this serotonin. So the serotonin never actually ends up where it needs to. You might ask, why does that cause OCD? The truth is we don't know. We do know that molecular changes such as these have a ripple effect on a behavioral level. We don't know that ripple effect though. So that is basically the first one. There's a bit of confusion what I'm going to go through in a second. A couple of explanations, a couple of evaluations. What we've looked at is biologically reductionist, and you need to understand what that means. It's not just saying, oh, it doesn't take that into account. I cannot express to you enough. That's not what reductionism is. Reductionism is when a theory reduces a complex behavior like a disorder down to being caused by one single thing. Now that is not, oh, you're not taking into account that. That is the issue of reductionism, is you are reducing it down to one thing. Don't focus on all the things that's being ignored. Focus on the fact that behavior is very rarely caused by one thing, and therefore it is theoretically parochial being narrow-minded. That's the issue of reductionism, is that it's too narrow-minded, it's too focused on this one thing. Yes, it's not taking other things into account. Fine, you can talk about that, but that's not what the actual issue is. Practical applications, though, are pretty good. So if we now know that genes are a bit of a problem, we can create drugs, and these drugs might tackle some of the serotonin issues there, and that can then go on and have major economic benefits, because we're keeping people who, quite frankly, 50 years ago could not work, and now these people are actually able to live a great quality of life. But face validity does kind of make sense. You do see OCD passed on in families. Yes, that may be taught parenting. Yes, it may be, you inadvertently teaching your kids to have OCD. But it does have face validity. Same thing with diabetes, right? You see it passed down in families. Now, the second one here, this is where it gets a bit confusing. I've already described this. So you can either come at what we've talked about so far from a genetic point of view. The faulty SERT gene causes your biochemistry to go wrong. So you can either talk about that from a genetic point of view and talk about the faulty SERT gene, or you can talk at it from a biochemical point of view and not talk about the SERT gene, but in fact talk about how this rapid reuptake of serotonin causes schizophrenia. You're kind of talking about the same explanation here, but you can be quite smart about this. If you're asked to give a genetic explanation, talk about the searching, for example. If you're asked to give a biochemical or a neural explanation, then just talk about this issue about faulty serotonin. So there's two explanations that you can break out of one, really. The third one, is horrible, right? I don't usually talk about this in too much detail a lot of the time, but I have added quite a bit here. Now, this is probably not going to be in your workbook because I don't. There's not really as much research on this. That is a tick, by the way, and not the kind of tick we were talking about earlier. That is a horrible tick. Ticks carry Lyme's disease. There has been a correlation made, a relationship between getting some illnesses and that triggering off OCD like disease or illness. And the three that have had a relationship are throat infections, Lyme's disease, and the flu. Now, most of you had throat infections. Most of you, I'd say about half of you maybe have had the flu. Not many of you would have had Lyme's disease, despite the fact that the south of England is a hotspot, particularly the New Forest, is a hotspot of Lyme's disease. But all three of these have got links to someone developing OCD. Now, it used to be just like and by the way, this is probably the more severe type of OCD. So, it's called PANDAS. It's called PANDAS. These forms of OCD come on very quickly, particularly in teenagers, and are referred to as PANDAS, pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders associated with throat infections, basically. PANDAS is a form of OCD that is brutal. That is absolutely brutal. It comes on very, very quickly. The teenager is usually overwhelmed in their ability because they're confused about what's happening to me. And it does often actually lead to institutionalization and sometimes suicide. And it's linked to getting a throat infection or by the way, it's usually young teenagers, right? The clue is in the name there, pediatric. It's usually young teenagers that get this. There's not enough research done on it, but it does seem to be a neural connection between getting a throat infection, Lyme's disease, and then having this overwhelming tidal wave tsunami-like OCD onset. Comes out of nowhere. You literally wake up with it. Many have had to be institutionalized. Many who suffer PANDAS, a form of OCD, do go on to make full recoveries, but it's a pretty harrowing experience for them. So they're typically quite different from other forms of OCD and come on overnight. The suddenness of the disorder mixed with the immediate lifestyle changes that you have to do. You can't go out with your friends, for example. You just can't do it. Is particularly difficult. So that is one explanation you can talk about. A very easy evaluation here. A very easy evaluation is that it's only a relationship. They don't know how one causes the other. There just seems to be when this happens, this happens. Right? But obviously, all of you had throat infections. Most of you had the flu, so it clearly doesn't happen in everyone. Finally, because it's been a long ass video. You have my favourite one, because I think this makes sense. So we've had a genetic explanation. We've had a biochemical explanation. This one is a neuroanatomical explanation. Something has gone physically wrong, not chemically, not genetically. Something has gone physically wrong with the brain. And in this case, the naughty part of your brain, not the naughty part of your brain, that was phrased terribly. The broken part of your brain or the malfunctioning is the caudate nucleus. So I like this one. I like students using this one because it's very terminological. So let's go through this. You've got three key parts of the brain here. And I want to go through each of these. The orbital frontal cortex is the problem identifier of the brain. So, for example, if you haven't brushed your teeth, it's your orbital frontal cortex that thinks, well, your breath is disgusting. Your teeth is disgusting. Your teeth is disgusting. It then throws that problem to the solution finding part of the brain, which is the cingulate gyrus. And the cingulate gyrus will come up with, okay, so the example they've got here is you've got germs on your hand, or I don't know, you've just gone to the toilet, for example. So your orbital frontal cortex thinks germs, 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 and then your cingulate gyrus says, well, wash your hands then, right? And in people who don't have OCD, once you've been washing your hands, singing happy birthday to yourself for 30 seconds, your cingulate gyrus then moves it onto the caudate nucleus. Your caudate nucleus is the part of your brain that says, you have done this job now, move on. Like, wash your hands, move on. When you brushed your teeth this morning, you needed a part of your brain to tell you, you've done this job now, move on. What happens if that part of your brain is broken and you fail to recognize that you've actually completed the job, the function that you were doing? In people with OCD, this is malfunctioning. Not broken, it's malfunctioning. It does work, but at a much less efficient level. So they are unable to move on from the job they are doing. Hence the reason it goes round and round and round and round. So specifically, Chen found that it's decreases in the left caudate nucleus connectivity that are positively associated. So it's the left caudate nucleus. You've got caudate nucleus in your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere. So orbital frontal cortex finds the problem, it passes it to the cingulate gyrus, and in neurotypical individuals, so people without OCD, they are able to recognize when they have done the job and they move on. But in people with OCD, non-neurotypical individuals, they will keep going around and eventually they will be able to move on, but it does take a long time. So, a couple of bits here, a bit more technical that I'm not going to go through. Feel free to have a look for it yourself. A couple of evaluations. Yes, it is able to be treated biologically. These are easy. Biological explanations are easy to actually tackle. They're biologically deterministic, and they say we have no free will. They are biologically reductionist, and they reduce complex behavior down to one single variable, which may be too simple. However, it is logical to conclude that OCD cannot solely be caused by the biology. There must be environmental factors into account, because I've not said the word 100% so far. And there's a model peel there as well. This is actually quite important, because this model peel is about reductionism, which people tend to get wrong. So have a look through this and how you would structure this, how narrow-minded it is, how parochial it is, because it's biologically reductionist and therefore it lacks explanatory power because it fails to explain wider factors, so on and so forth. Anyway, that was a long-ass video, but I hope it was useful. This bullet point is quite tricky because there are quite a lot, but the main thing I would say is be able to separate out what the genetic explanations are from what the neural explanations are. Only the first one was genetic. The other three were neuro, biochemical, etc., etc. Hope that was useful. Peace out.